When your feelings make your decisions, your life is being directed by impulse rather than intention. That is the quiet truth most people have sensed but never fully examined. They believe they are thinking deliberately, choosing freely, and moving towards something they consciously want. But behind the surface of those beliefs, their behavior is being driven by something older and less considered. A small frustration becomes a sharp word. A moment of discomfort becomes another day of avoidance. A fleeting mood shapes a choice that carries consequences for months. Over time, that pattern builds a life nobody deliberately chose. This book is not about becoming emotionless. It is not about turning yourself into someone cold, rigid, or removed from the richness of feeling. Emotions are not the problem. They are part of being alive, and suppressing them does not strengthen you. It only drives them underground, where they accumulate and return with more force than before. The problem begins at a specific point, when emotions are allowed to give the orders. When a feeling says go and the mind obeys without pausing to consider whether going serves you. When anxiety says retreat and you shrink without asking whether retreating is actually the wiser move. When comfort says stay still and you remain exactly where you are, while everything you want remains just out of reach. Here is the truth that this book is built on. Your emotions are messengers. Your mind is the instrument. And you are meant to be the one who leads. When the mind is left untrained, emotions move into that leadership role by default, not because they are smarter or more qualified, but because no one else has stepped forward to occupy it. When the mind is trained, emotions continue to speak. They still arise. They still carry their signals. But they no longer command. You receive them, acknowledge what they are telling you, and then you choose your response with intention rather than reflex. Almost no one is taught how to do this. From childhood onward, people are taught to express themselves, to follow their feelings, to seek relief from discomfort, and to trust their emotional reactions as reliable guides. They are taught very little about how to pause. How to sit with what is uncomfortable rather than escape it. How to remain steady when everything inside them is pushing for immediate action. So when pressure arrives, the automatic response takes over. When temptation appears, the easiest path wins. When something difficult must be done, the feeling of not wanting to do it becomes, effectively, a veto. This book exists to change that. Not through motivation, which is temporary and unreliable. Not through inspiration, which fades with the next difficulty. Through training. Practical, repeatable, applicable mental training that teaches you to separate feeling from action, to create the interval between impulse and behavior, and to build the kind of inner authority that holds steady when life pushes back. Over the following 8 chapters, you will learn why the mind was never trained to lead, only to react. You will understand why emotions, despite their intensity, are signals rather than commanders. You will learn how to construct the pause that stands between feeling and response. And why that pause is where all genuine control lives. You will discover why discipline consistently outperforms motivation over any meaningful length of time. You will learn to act on difficult things without waiting for resistance to disappear first. You will develop the skill of observing your own thoughts without being governed by them. You will build calm as a practiced capacity rather than a personality accident. And you will learn how to make all of this a daily structure rather than an occasional effort. Each of these is a real skill. None of them is natural. All of them are trainable. And together they produce something that transforms how you move through every day, the experience of being the one who decides, even when every emotion is arguing for something else. By the time you finish, you will not be someone who does not feel. You will be someone who feels fully and responds deliberately. You will not be passive or disconnected. You will be grounded. And you will stop experiencing yourself as someone at the mercy of your own reactions. Because you will have learned how to lead from the inside out. Do not rush through what follows. Treat it as training, not entertainment. The goal is not to feel briefly inspired. The goal is to build a mind that follows your direction. If you are ready to stop being moved through life by moods, impulses, and emotional tides, then this is where that change begins. Chapter 1: Your mind was never taught to lead. Before you assume that your struggles with self-control reflect something lacking in your character, consider a different explanation. You were never trained for this. From the earliest years of your development, you were taught a great deal about how to function in the world. How to read, to speak, to navigate relationships, to perform in academic and social settings. You were taught how to express what you feel, how to seek comfort when situations become difficult, and how to communicate your needs to others. What almost nobody taught you was how to lead your own mind. How to stand in front of your own internal experience and direct it, rather than simply follow wherever it goes. Without that training, when pressure arrives, emotions fill the leadership vacuum by default. Not because they are wise or because they have your long-term interests at heart, but because nothing else is present to step into the role. An untrained mind is not a broken mind. It is simply a mind that has never been shown what it is capable of beyond reacting to whatever it feels most strongly in any given moment. The pattern shows up everywhere, once you learn to recognize it. You decide to respond calmly to something that irritates you, and then the irritation speaks first before the decision has a chance. You commit to focused work, and within minutes something pulls you away and you find yourself somewhere else entirely without having consciously chosen to move. You tell yourself that this time will be different, and then the first moment of friction sends you back to the familiar comfort of doing nothing. You know, clearly and specifically, what the right course of action is. And you do something else instead. Each of these moments, taken alone, is a minor inconvenience. Accumulated across months and years, they create something far more serious, a fracture in your relationship with yourself. When your behavior keeps contradicting your intentions, you begin, quietly and without naming it, to stop believing your own commitments. You stop trusting that the decision you make today will actually be honored by the person you are tomorrow. That erosion of self-trust is the true cost of an untrained mind. It is not dramatic. It accumulates slowly. And it shapes every area of life where consistency and follow-through matter. Most people who struggle with this make a specific mistake in how they interpret it. They assume that disciplined people are simply built differently. That calm people are temperamentally unlike them. That focused, consistent individuals are fortunate recipients of qualities that others lack. None of this is accurate. Control is not a personality trait distributed unequally at birth. Calm is not the natural state of people who have easier lives. Discipline is not the overflow of abundant motivation. These are trained capacities. They were built, deliberately, through repetition. They look effortless from the outside because they have been practiced long enough to become automatic. But they were not given. They were earned. Your brain was shaped by a long evolutionary history to prioritize survival above every other consideration. That means it scans constantly for threat, amplifies the presence of discomfort, and pushes urgently toward actions that reduce tension as quickly as possible. Stress says leave this situation now. Anxiety says avoid this before something goes wrong. Anger says respond to this threat immediately. The pull of comfort says stay where it is safe. None of these voices are asking whether their advice serves your long-term direction. They are exclusively concerned with short-term relief. When relief becomes the primary goal, growth stops. Progress stalls. The life you want remains perpetually in the future, while the version of yourself that could reach it never quite develops. The mind you have right now was shaped largely by repetition that you did not consciously choose. Every time you reacted without pausing, you reinforced the neural pathway that makes reactive behavior more automatic. Every time you avoided something uncomfortable, you taught your mind that avoidance is the correct response to difficulty. Every time you followed a feeling without questioning it, you gave that feeling additional authority over your behavior. Year after year, those repetitions compounded into patterns that now feel like your natural personality. They are not. They are what you practiced most. The recognition of this is where everything changes. Not with self-criticism, not with shame about the years already shaped by those patterns, but with clarity about what those patterns actually are. They are habits. Habits can be changed. The mechanism that built the patterns that do not serve you is the exact same mechanism that can build the patterns that do. The difference is intention and direction. Your mind was designed to serve you, not to dominate you. But service requires structure. Without direction, the mind runs on autopilot. It follows whatever feels most familiar. It jumps between thoughts without settling. It generates activity without producing progress. Training is the structure that changes this. It begins not with forcing behavior but with awareness, noticing when you are reacting rather than choosing, observing the physical signals of emotional activation before they convert fully into behavior, and recognizing the thoughts that are pulling you without your conscious agreement. The untrained mind believes every thought it produces. It treats emotional intensity as a reliable indicator of truth. It confuses the strength of a feeling with the correctness of the action the feeling demands. Training introduces the ability to separate these things. You begin to see thoughts as events rather than orders. You begin to experience emotions as information rather than instructions. And you begin to understand yourself as the one who decides what happens next with that information. At first, this separation creates discomfort. The mind resists having its authority questioned. When you pause rather than immediately reacting, something inside protests that pausing is dangerous. The familiar system pushes back because it is losing its position. That resistance is not evidence that training is going wrong. It is evidence that training has genuinely begun. You are not trying to become someone different. You are learning to occupy a role you were never shown how to fill. The role of the one who leads from the inside. The one who can feel every emotion without being commanded by it. The one who can choose the direction of the next action, even when everything inside is arguing for something easier. That capacity is in you. It has simply never been developed. And development begins the moment you understand that the patterns running your behavior are not who you are. They are what you practiced. And you can practice something different. Chapter 2: Emotions are messengers, not commanders. There is a way of living in relation to your own emotional experience that most people never question, because it feels completely natural. An emotion arises, and you respond to what it is demanding. Anger arrives, and you speak. Fear shows up, and you withdraw. Frustration builds, and you escape. Desire appears, and you pursue it. The whole sequence takes seconds and feels almost involuntary, as if the emotion and the action that follows are a single event rather than two distinct things with space between them. But this sequence is not inevitable. It is practiced. And practicing it without awareness has a cost. Emotions are not commands. They are signals. This distinction is not merely philosophical. It is the practical core of self-command, and understanding it fully changes the relationship you have with your own inner experience. A signal exists to transmit information. Pain signals that tissue is under threat. Hunger signals that the body needs nourishment. Fear signals that something in your environment or circumstances may require caution. Anger signals that something important to you feels violated or at risk. Each of these signals carries real and useful information. Without them, you would be cut off from crucial data about what is happening inside you and around you. The signal itself is not the problem. The problem is the step from signal to command that happens automatically in an untrained mind. When an emotion arises, it creates a physical experience in the body and a narrative in the mind. The body tightens, heats up, or braces. The mind adds interpretation, assumption, and conclusion. Together they generate pressure, the felt sense that this situation requires immediate response. Speak now. Defend now. Escape now. Act now. If you have never trained the space between that pressure and your behavior, the response follows the pressure as naturally as a reflex follows a tap on the knee. Think about what happens when anger is treated as a commander rather than a signal. Anger, as a signal, tells you something true and potentially useful. Something that matters to you has been crossed. Something important feels threatened. That information is worth receiving. But anger as a commander tells you to respond immediately, without considering the relationship, the consequences, or whether the response will actually serve what you care about. Anger does not think ahead. It does not weigh long-term cost against short-term relief. If it were always obeyed, without question, the relationships and situations most important to you would bear the marks of every moment you were activated. The same applies to fear. Fear as a signal tells you that uncertainty is present and that caution may be warranted. That is genuine information. But fear as a commander systematically overestimates danger, argues against action, and works to keep you exactly where you are. If fear were always followed, every opportunity that required stepping into uncertainty would be declined. Every conversation that carried the risk of judgment would be avoided. Every direction that demanded exposure to the possibility of failure would remain untaken. The signal is useful. The command is not reliable. Training your mind to lead means developing the capacity to receive the signal while retaining the authority to decide the response. You feel the emotion fully. You acknowledge what it is communicating. And then you introduce a delay, a space between the emotional input and the behavioral output, that makes genuine choice possible. Most people have never experienced this gap because they have never been shown how to create it. They operate under a belief that is so deeply embedded it functions like a law. Feeling and doing are inseparable. I feel something strongly, therefore I must act on it. This belief feels natural only because it has been practiced for so long. It is not truth. It is conditioning. Conditioning can be changed. When you begin to practice creating the gap, the mind initially resists. It interprets the delay as a threat to its existing pattern of operation. It tells you that waiting is dangerous, that something will go wrong if you do not act on this feeling immediately, that the urgency you feel is a reliable guide. To timing. This resistance is the emotional system attempting to maintain its position. It thrives on immediacy. Introducing a pause threatens that control. Here is what training looks like in practice. When an emotion rises, you acknowledge it without becoming it. You name what is present. Not, I am angry, but, anger is here. Not, I am afraid, but, fear is present. This linguistic shift is not trivial. It creates a subtle but real distance between you and the emotional state. You are no longer inside it. You are observing it. And from the position of observer, its authority diminishes. Then you remind yourself of something simple and rarely practiced: feeling something does not require acting on it. You can be angry and choose silence. You can be afraid and choose to move forward anyway. You can feel the pull of comfort and choose effort instead. The emotion does not need to disappear before you act according to your values rather than your activation level. The two can coexist. The emotion and the chosen response are not the same thing and do not have to point in the same direction. Over time, this practice reshapes the relationship between emotional state and behavior at a fundamental level. The mind learns that emotions are not emergencies. They are experiences that arise, reach a peak, and pass when not fed by reactive behavior. When you stop responding automatically, emotions lose their grip faster, not because you fought them but because you declined to amplify them through action. This is also where you stop making emotions personal in a way that escalates rather than clarifies. Instead of, I am anxious, notice, anxiety is present. Instead of, I am overwhelmed, notice, pressure is here. These are not denials. They are accurate descriptions. You are not the emotional state that is passing through you. You are the one who notices it. That noticing is the position of authority. Reclaim it consistently and emotions become genuinely useful rather than perpetually disruptive. They inform. They no longer command. Chapter 3: The Pause That Changes Everything. Between feeling and action, there is a space. In most people, that space is so compressed it barely exists. The feeling arrives and the action follows almost simultaneously, as if the two were a single event. Learning to widen that space is not simply one useful technique among many. It is the foundation on which every other aspect of self-command is built. The pause does not need to be long. This is worth saying clearly because people imagine that the solution to reactive behavior involves extensive deliberation before every decision. That is not what this is. The pause needed to reclaim authority over your responses can be seconds. It can be one conscious breath. What matters is not the duration. What matters is the interruption. When an emotion rises, it generates momentum. The body activates, the breath shortens, the mind narrows its focus, and the pressure toward immediate release builds. That pressure feels real. It feels urgent. It feels, in many moments, like a form of danger that can only be resolved through action. But urgency is frequently just discomfort demanding relief. And acting inside that urgency, allowing the feeling to dictate the timing of your response, reinforces the belief that emotions must be obeyed quickly. Each time you act on that urgency without pause, you teach your behavior system that the pressure cannot be tolerated and that relief must come immediately. The pause interrupts that teaching. It sends a different message: we are not moving yet. It transfers authority away from the emotional signal and places it, briefly but meaningfully, back with the part of you that can choose deliberately. The emotion is still there. The feeling has not been eliminated. But it no longer controls what happens next. Building this pause begins with physical awareness, because emotions live in the body before they become narratives in the mind. A tightening across the chest. A change in the quality and depth of breath. A clenching somewhere in the jaw or shoulders. A quickening of the heartbeat. These are early indicators, present before the full emotional charge has built and before it has converted entirely into behavior. Learning to notice them at this early stage gives you more options. You are catching the process before it has reached full intensity. The simplest and most immediate way to introduce the pause is through controlled breathing. Not breathing for relaxation, but breathing as a mechanism of deliberate interruption. 1 slow, conscious inhale. 1 extended, controlled exhale. This single cycle does something physiologically real. It sends a signal to the nervous system that immediate survival action is not required. It creates a fractional physical settling that makes awareness possible again. The pause does not eliminate the emotion. It lowers the volume slightly, which is enough to allow deliberate thought to re-enter. During the pause, one question is useful. Not a complex, philosophical inquiry, but a practical one that can be asked in a few seconds. What response aligns with who I am choosing to be? This question redirects attention away from the feeling and toward values. It acknowledges that the emotion is present and then asks something more important. Given that this is happening, what is the best version of my response? Emotions are temporary. The consequences of how you respond to them are not. The pause creates the interval in which that difference can be recognized. Initially, the pause will feel uncomfortable in a specific way. The emotions you are delaying will resist being delayed. They will escalate slightly, telling you that waiting is making things worse. That silence will cost you something, that inaction in this moment is itself a form of harm. This is the system that has always controlled timing, trying to reassert its position. It equates speed with safety. In situations where actual physical danger is present, that equation is correct. In virtually every other context of modern life, it is not. Speed in emotionally charged situations is usually what creates the damage that later requires repair. The practical reality of the pause becomes clearer when you consider what most regret actually comes from. Not from carefully considered decisions made with full awareness. From rushed reactions. From words delivered while fully activated that cannot be unsaid. From choices made to end discomfort quickly that create larger problems downstream. The pause does not guarantee a perfect response. It creates the opportunity for a deliberate one. Over time, deliberate responses produce far fewer regrets than impulsive ones, which means the pause is not just a tool for a single situation. It is a practice that changes the overall trajectory of your decisions. There will be moments when the pause feels nearly impossible, when the emotional charge is so high that any delay seems unbearable. These are precisely the moments when the practice matters most. If you can hold the pause here, even briefly, even imperfectly, you are proving to yourself something that slowly becomes foundational. Feelings do not dictate behavior. That proof is not given to you by someone else. It is built by you, moment by moment, through the repeated act of choosing to wait when every impulse says act now. As you practice this consistently, something gradually changes. Emotions begin to lose the urgency that made them feel so commanding. Not because they disappear or because you become numb, but because they learn that rushing no longer gets results. The behavioral system adapts. It stops treating every emotion as an emergency requiring immediate resolution. The gap that once did not exist begins to widen naturally, with less effort, until the pause becomes your default rather than your exception. In that small interval between feeling and response, your freedom lives. Protect it. Build it daily. Because without the pause, there is no leadership. There is only reaction wearing the appearance of choice. Chapter 4: Why Discipline Consistently Outperforms Motivation. Motivation, when it appears, feels like an ally. It arrives with energy, with a sense of readiness, with the temporary but convincing feeling that effort will be easy today and that your desired direction is clear. In those moments, action flows without resistance. You feel capable, aligned, and ready to build something. And then it leaves. Without warning, without a reliable schedule, without enough notice for you to build on it before it disappears. This is the essential problem with building your behavior around motivation. Not that motivation is harmful, but that it is an emotional state. And emotional states are, by their nature, temporary. They rise and fall according to energy levels, environmental feedback, physical condition, and the unpredictable movement of mood. When motivation is present, you act. When it fades, you stop. The result is a pattern of enthusiastic starts and abandoned middles, of bold declarations followed by quiet disappearances, of progress measured in bursts that never quite compound into the sustained change you were reaching for. Most people, when they notice this cycle, conclude that something is wrong with them. That their inability to sustain momentum reflects a personal deficiency. In reality, the problem is structural. They have built their behavior on a foundation that cannot hold weight. When motivation leads, emotions still decide. Every day you check how you feel before you act. Every time the feeling is absent, you wait. And waiting, experienced often enough, becomes its own habit. Discipline operates from a different principle entirely. Discipline is not a feeling. It is a decision. Made in advance and honored regardless of how things feel when the moment arrives to act on it. Discipline does not consult your emotional state before acting. It asks a different question: what did I decide matters? The answer to that question was established before the resistance appeared, before the fatigue set in, before the comfort of not acting began to compete with the discomfort of following through. Discipline acts on the earlier decision rather than the current feeling. This distinction, small as it sounds, relocates authority. When motivation leads, the emotional state of the moment decides. When discipline leads, your considered intention decides. These produce different lives over time. Not because one feels better than the other, but because one is reliable and the other is not. The untrained mind resists discipline because discipline removes the negotiation that comfort depends on. The untrained mind prefers to revisit commitments in real time, to reconsider them whenever they feel inconvenient, to find reasons why today is an exception. This sounds like flexibility, but it is actually a form of emotional control over your behavior. The mind produces thoughts that feel logical and reasonable. Not today, you need rest, this particular circumstance is different, you can begin again tomorrow. These are not neutral observations. They are emotional delays dressed in the language of practical reasoning. Each time you accept them, you reinforce the lesson that resistance works. Discipline ends the conversation before it starts. When you act without waiting for motivation, you send a clear signal to your own system: feelings do not control timing. The decision has been made. The action will follow. Initially, the mind responds to this by intensifying the resistance. It amplifies discomfort. It makes fatigue feel more acute. It produces more elaborate justifications. This is not a sign of failure. It is the mind testing whether the old rules still apply. It is checking whether discomfort still has veto power over your behavior. If you continue acting anyway, the mind begins the process of adaptation. It learns that escalating complaint no longer changes the outcome. And over time, the escalation stops, because it has ceased to be useful. One of the most useful reframings of discipline is this: discipline is not harsh. It is honest. It is not a form of self-punishment or rigidity. It is the calm, firm acknowledgement that effort is required. And that discomfort is not a reliable signal to stop. A disciplined mind feels tired and acts. It feels reluctant and acts. It feels the pull of distraction and redirects. The emotion and the action exist simultaneously, rather than the emotion determining whether the action occurs at all. Discipline also produces something that motivation can never reliably deliver: consistency. Consistency, applied over time, is what actually shapes a life. Not the exceptional days when everything flows and effort feels natural. The ordinary days when nothing feels exceptional and you act anyway. Those days accumulate into identity, into capacity, into the kind of track record that eventually makes self-trust possible. There is a deeper shift that happens when discipline becomes part of how you understand yourself. You stop identifying as someone who performs when motivated. You begin to identify as someone who follows through. Identity shapes behavior more reliably than emotion. When following through is who you are rather than something you occasionally manage, action becomes expected rather than exceptional. The resistance that once felt heavy begins to feel like ordinary weather, present sometimes, not worth noting, certainly not worth stopping for. Discipline does not remove emotion from your life. It places emotion in its appropriate role. You still feel the full range of your experience. You still have days when everything feels heavy and days when it feels light. But neither the heaviness nor the lightness controls your behavior. Your considered decisions do. That is why discipline, maintained consistently, produces results that motivation admires from a distance but can never quite sustain on its own. Chapter 5: Learning to Act Through Resistance. The mind avoids difficulty by design. This is not a flaw. It is a deeply embedded survival strategy that served human beings across the vast majority of their history. When effort signals danger, avoiding effort is wise. When the unfamiliar might be fatal, comfort is protective. That wiring runs deep and remains active regardless of how safe and stable your actual circumstances are. The problem is not the design. The problem is what happens when the design goes unchallenged. In a context where difficulty no longer signals danger but instead signals growth. Every time you avoid something uncomfortable, your mind records a lesson. It learns that discomfort is a signal to stop. It learns that delay is a legitimate protective response. It learns that escape works. These lessons are not taught explicitly. They are absorbed through repetition. Reinforced each time the feeling of resistance leads to withdrawal from whatever was resisted. Over years, this pattern becomes so automatic you stop recognizing it as a pattern at all. You call it low energy, lack of motivation, procrastination, or simply not being ready. But beneath these descriptions is a single trained response: discomfort appears, and avoidance follows. Breaking this pattern requires doing something the mind deeply resists, choosing the difficult thing not despite the resistance but while it is present. This is the training principle that everything else rests on. You do not wait for resistance to fade and then act. You act while resistance is active. Which is the only way to teach the mind that resistance is not, in fact, a reliable signal to stop. The crucial distinction in this kind of training is between difficulty that is harmful and difficulty that is simply requiring effort. The mind does not naturally make this distinction. It registers the sensation of effort the same way it registers the sensation of actual threat, with an urgent internal communication to stop, to rest, to seek relief. Training means learning to hear that communication and assess it honestly. Is this genuinely dangerous? Or is this effort, discomfort, and uncertainty that come with building something? When the honest answer is the latter, acting anyway is not recklessness. It is training. Strength is built by acting before it has fully arrived, not by waiting until you feel it. This is one of the most consistently misunderstood dynamics in development of any kind. People wait to feel strong before taking the action that would demonstrate strength. They wait for confidence before doing the thing that confidence comes from. They wait for readiness, which is a feeling, before beginning, which is an action. But the sequence doesn't work in that direction. Confidence follows action. Readiness emerges from beginning. Strength is produced by acting through its absence, not by waiting for its presence. When you choose difficulty, something important happens beyond the immediate task. You are not just completing whatever is in front of you. You are establishing who makes decisions about your behavior. You are reinforcing, at a level the mind genuinely tracks, that you are the one who determines direction, not the current feeling. Difficulty chosen by you strengthens authority. Difficulty merely endured when imposed on you can create resentment. The act of choosing is what makes the difference. Difficult things often look ordinary. Staying focused when distraction is readily available. Finishing what you began even when momentum has slowed and the initial energy is gone. Telling the truth in a moment when a comfortable silence would cost nothing apparent. Starting when every internal voice is arguing for delay. These moments are not dramatic. But they are where the training actually happens. Each one is an opportunity to establish the rule: discomfort does not stop action. When you first begin acting through resistance consistently, the resistance is loud. The mind complains with full conviction. It produces reasons that feel logical and urgent. Not today. You are exhausted. This can wait. These are not random thoughts. They are the mind's attempt to reclaim its authority over behavior by making the cost of continuing feel higher than the cost of stopping. If you can see them for what they are, attempts at control rather than genuine assessments, you can continue anyway, and the continuation is what teaches the lesson that needs to be learned. Failure will still happen. There will be days when comfort wins. When the difficult thing does not get done and the resistance succeeds. Those days do not erase what has been built. What matters is the pattern of return. Do you collapse into self-criticism after falling short, which creates shame? That makes the next attempt harder. Or do you simply notice what happened and make the next decision without drama? Returning without shame is itself a form of discipline. Clarity is what restores progress. Shame is what delays it. Your relationship with discomfort will transform as this training develops. What once felt threatening will begin to feel familiar. Not comfortable, but familiar. The mind adapts to what you require of it repeatedly. When it learns, through consistent experience, that effort does not lead to catastrophe, its resistance to effort softens. Not because it surrenders, but because it adapts to the actual conditions you are creating through your choices. You become progressively more capable. Not because the challenges become smaller, but because you have grown into them. Chapter 6: Observing your thoughts without being led by them. Most people live in an unexamined relationship with their own thinking. A thought appears and they treat it as if it were a reliable report on reality. A negative thought arrives and mood descends. A thought about failure appears and action halts. A critical thought speaks and self-confidence shrinks. In response, the whole process is so immediate and so automatic that it can feel like the thoughts themselves are deciding everything, with the person simply experiencing the downstream effects. This experience rests on a belief that almost everyone holds without questioning it, that they are their thoughts. That what the mind produces is essentially who they are. That there is no meaningful distance between the thinker and the thinking. This belief is one of the most consequential illusions the untrained mind maintains. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who notices them. And that distinction, when genuinely understood and practiced, changes everything about the authority that thoughts hold over your experience and behavior. Thoughts are mental events. They arise from habit, from memory, from emotional state, from patterns laid down by years of conditioning. Many of them are repetitive. The same fears, the same self-limiting narratives, the same assumptions that have cycled through your mind thousands of times without ever becoming more accurate simply through repetition. Many of them are inaccurate, contradictory, irrelevant to what is actually needed in the present moment. The untrained mind does not filter or evaluate. It treats every thought as equally real and equally deserving of response. This is exhausting and, more importantly, unnecessary. The common mistake people make when they realize that their thoughts are not serving them is to try to fight them. They argue with the negative thought. They attempt to replace it with a positive one. They try to force the mind into a different content through willpower. This approach consistently backfires. Fighting a thought is a form of engagement, and engagement gives the thought more attention, more energy, and more presence than it would have if simply allowed to pass. What you resist mentally, you strengthen. The battle confirms the thought's importance. Observation works from an entirely different premise. Observation does not argue, replace, or resist. It notices. When a thought appears, you acknowledge its presence without following it. Without building on it, without letting it decide anything about your state or your next action. You notice there is a thought about inadequacy. You notice the mind is producing a story about failure. You notice that doubt is speaking. And having noticed, you do not continue the conversation the thought was trying to start. This capacity requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your relationship to your own mind. The observer and the observed are different things. The part of you that can watch a thought arise is not the same as the thought itself. When you are inside the thought, it feels like reality. When you step back and watch it arrive, it reveals itself as an event, something that passed through, rather than something that is true. The mind resists this change of relationship because it wants to be engaged with constantly. It wants to be heard, responded to, built upon. When you decline to engage, it often escalates. Thoughts become louder, more insistent, more dramatic. This is not evidence that the practice of observation is failing. It is evidence that the mind is testing whether its old strategy still works. If you remain neutral, something important happens. Without the engagement that was fueling the thought's momentum, it loses energy. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But consistently and reliably, over time, the volume lowers. One practical method is labeling. When a thought arrives, name what category it belongs to. This is a worry thought. This is a self-critical thought. This is the familiar doubt pattern. The naming does something psychologically real. It creates a small distance between you and the content of the thought. It frames the thought as something you are experiencing rather than something you are. That frame is accurate. And accuracy, applied here, reduces the authority of the thought over your state. Language matters beyond just labeling. The shift from, "I am anxious," to "anxious thoughts are present," is not a semantic game. It is a reorientation of identity. One statement puts you inside the emotional content. The other places you as the observer of it. Your perception shapes your experience. Perception shaped by identification with mental content keeps you reactive. Perception shaped by observation of mental content makes you genuinely selective. Detachment, properly understood, does not make you passive or indifferent. It makes you precise. A mind that is no longer subject to every thought that passes through it becomes more capable of directing attention to what is actually useful. Useful thoughts receive attention. Thoughts that would feed anxiety, undermine confidence, or pull toward avoidance are allowed to pass without being followed. This selectivity is itself a form of authority. The practice requires patience. You will be carried back into your thoughts. You will find yourself deep inside a familiar narrative before you notice it has happened. This is normal. Training is not about maintaining constant detachment. It is about shortening the time between being carried away and returning to the position of observer. Each return is a repetition of the skill. Each repetition shortens the interval. Over time, thoughts lighten. They continue to arrive. The mind does not stop producing its content. But the content carries less weight. Familiar fears no longer automatically generate avoidance. Familiar self-criticisms no longer automatically reduce capacity. You begin to experience, consistently and reliably, a space between what the mind produces and what you do with it. That space is not detachment from life. That space is freedom. Chapter 7, Building Calm as a Practiced Skill. Calm is widely misunderstood. Most people believe it is a quality distributed unevenly among personalities, that some people are naturally settled while others are naturally reactive, and that the difference is largely genetic or circumstantial. Under this belief, those who regularly feel overwhelmed have simply drawn an unfavorable card. There is not much to be done about it. This belief is understandable. It is also incorrect. And the cost of holding it is the perpetual abdication of a skill that is genuinely learnable. Calm is not a personality trait. It is a trained response. And like every trained response, its development depends not on what you feel naturally but on what you practice deliberately. When emotional intensity rises, the body responds automatically. Heart rate increases, breath shortens and quickens, muscles engage, and attention narrows. You did not choose this. It is the body's preparation for action under perceived threat. This physiological response is fast and real. And it cannot be prevented by deciding to remain calm. What can be trained is what happens next. The automatic physical response is the first layer. The second layer, the response to the first layer, is where training lives. Most people confuse calm with suppression and pay an ongoing cost for that confusion. They try to push down what is arising, to perform composure on the surface while internal pressure builds, to avoid acknowledging the emotional content. This does not produce calm. It produces a kind of internal compression that eventually releases in the direction of least resistance, usually at an inopportune moment and with more force than if the emotion had been acknowledged and regulated, rather than suppressed. Real calm does not require the emotion to disappear. It requires the ability to regulate your Response while the emotion is present. You feel the activation. You acknowledge it honestly. And then, rather than either surrendering to it or fighting against it, you work with the physical systems available to you to restore the conditions in which deliberate thought is possible. Breath is the most accessible of these systems. Not relaxation breathing performed during a quiet moment, but controlled breathing applied in the middle of activation. A slow, deliberate exhale, extended a few seconds longer than feels natural, communicates something to the nervous system. It signals that the situation does not require immediate survival action. This signal is physiologically real. It doesn't eliminate the emotion. It reduces its volume slightly, which is enough to allow awareness to return, and awareness is the necessary precondition of any deliberate response. Physical posture is a less obvious but significant factor in the maintenance of calm. When emotional intensity rises, the body often shifts to configurations that amplify the signal it is sending to the brain, shoulders rolling forward, jaw clenching, chest tightening around a shallower breath. These configurations communicate stress to the mind just as much as the mind communicates stress to the body. Deliberately adjusting posture, lengthening the spine, releasing the jaw, dropping the shoulders back and down, sends a different signal. The body and the mind are in constant dialogue. You can use the body's side of that dialogue intentionally. The language you use internally during intense emotional moments also has measurable effects on the intensity itself. When the mind's narrative escalates alongside the emotional charge, using dramatic language, "This is unbearable, everything is falling apart, I cannot handle this," the perceived threat level rises, which intensifies the physical response, which amplifies the emotional experience. Replacing that internal language with neutral description, strong emotion is present, pressure is here. Right now, something difficult is happening, does not deny what is occurring. It describes it accurately without amplifying it. Reduced drama in the internal narrative reduces the physiological response that the drama was feeding. One of the most practically important elements of staying calm is granting yourself permission to delay response. Many people operate under an implicit rule that composure means resolving the situation quickly and cleanly. In reality, the single most effective thing you can do during peak emotional activation is nothing. Silence. Stillness. Waiting. Not as avoidance of the issue, but as a deliberate withholding of response until the first wave of emotional intensity has passed. Emotions that are not fed by reactive behavior peak and subside naturally. Reacting feeds them and extends their influence. Waiting starves them of the momentum they need to escalate further. This is particularly important because the moments when action feels most urgent are usually the moments when the action available would cause the most damage. The sharpest words arrive when the emotional charge is highest. The most extreme decisions present themselves as obvious when perspective is most compressed. The pause that calm makes possible is not an obstacle to effective response. It is the thing that makes an effective response possible at all. Calm under pressure is where the skill actually shows. Appearing settled when nothing is. Demanding your composure is not a test of anything. Maintaining access to clear thinking when something real is activating your emotional system is where training proves itself. This is why deliberate exposure to managed stress is part of building the capacity. Not overwhelming pressure, but real situations that activate the system. Difficult conversations. Uncertainty. Constraint. Each situation encountered with the intention to regulate rather than react builds the muscle that calm requires. You will lose composure sometimes. Moments will break through the training. This is not a sign that the training has failed. It is a sign that the training is being tested, which is how training becomes reliable. What matters is recovery. How quickly do you return to regulation after losing it? Recovery speed is itself a learnable quality that shortens with consistent practice. Each time you notice you have broken composure and choose to return without self-attack, you have completed a full training cycle. Calm people are frequently misread as indifferent. They are not. They care about what is happening. They simply do not let their caring express itself through impulsive behavior that undermines what they actually want to achieve. That restraint is not disengagement. It is authority. And the relationships and situations that benefit from it are more stable, more trustworthy, and more productive than those shaped by reactive intensity. Remember this: calm is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of the skill that keeps emotion from making the decisions. Chapter 8: Making Leadership a Daily Practice. Everything covered in the previous chapters has a common limitation. Understanding is not control. Clarity about what these principles mean does not automatically produce the behavior they describe. You can finish reading every word in this book and find yourself, 3 days later, responding exactly as you always have, because the patterns that have run your behavior for years are not dismantled by comprehension. They are dismantled by practice, applied consistently, until new patterns replace the old ones at the level where behavior actually originates. This final chapter is about how to prevent the familiar slide back into autopilot that follows almost every encounter with ideas about change. The slide is real. It happens to almost everyone. Life becomes demanding again, attention gets redirected to immediate pressures, and the mind, relieved of the active effort of training, defaults to what it knows. Old patterns reassert themselves. Quietly, without drama, simply by being the well-practiced alternative to what was just briefly learned. Your mind does not obey insights. It obeys patterns. What you repeat becomes authoritative. What you practice becomes automatic. This means that the gap between understanding something and actually living it is filled entirely by repetition. Not occasional repetition. Not intense periods of effort followed by breaks. Consistent, daily, unglamorous repetition that builds structure at the level where behavior is actually generated. The most common mistake in applying what you know about self-command is relying primarily on willpower. Willpower is a limited resource. It fluctuates with sleep quality, with stress levels, with physical condition, and with the cumulative number of decisions already made in a given day. When willpower runs out, the system does not simply pause and wait for it to refill. It hands control back to whatever behavioral pattern is most deeply established. This is why willpower-based approaches to change produce the cycle most people recognize: strong in the morning, weakening through the day, failed by evening. The depletion is real, and the pattern that fills the gap when willpower empties is the one that needed changing in the first place. Systems carry you when willpower cannot. A system is a structure decided in advance that reduces the need for real-time decision-making. When the behaviors that support your inner leadership are encoded into predictable routines rather than requiring fresh decisions each day, you preserve the mental energy that would have been spent negotiating and redirect it toward simply executing what was already chosen. Start by identifying a small number of non-negotiable daily behaviors. Not many. 2 or 3. At most. These should be actions you perform every day without internal debate. A consistent time at which the day begins. A period of focused work before anything else competes for attention. A daily practice of pausing before responding to something that would otherwise trigger a reactive reply. The specific behaviors matter less than their consistency. What matters is that they are fixed, that They do not require a daily decision about whether to perform them, and that they are maintained. Even on the days when the motivation to maintain them is entirely absent. When behaviors become non-negotiable, the mind stops arguing about them. This happens gradually but reliably. The resistance that initially accompanies any new behavioral standard fades. Not because the commitment felt good or because the day was easy, but because the resistance stopped working. The mind adapts to what you enforce consistently. When it learns that a particular behavior will happen regardless of how it responds to the prospect of that behavior, it directs its energy elsewhere. Obedience emerges not from force but from the consistent experience of futility. In resisting, identity is the deeper anchor for all of this. The mind follows identity more reliably than it follows goals, because goals are future-oriented and identity is continuous. A goal lives in the distance, subject to revision when resistance is high. Identity is present in every moment and shapes behavior before the question of whether to act is even consciously asked. Reinforcing who you are becoming, rather than only tracking what you are trying to achieve, builds the self-concept that behavior naturally aligns with. You are someone who acts before waiting for the right mood. You are someone who honors commitments even when they are difficult. You are someone who pauses before reacting. These are not aspirations. They are descriptions of standards you enforce through action. Every time you act in alignment with them, you strengthen them. Every time you compromise them, they weaken. The mind tracks this honestly. Simple daily reflection supports this process. Not extensive journaling or lengthy analysis. A brief, honest look at where you led today and where you reacted. No judgment attached. Just observation. Where did you pause before responding? Where did you act on a decision rather than wait for motivation? Where did the old pattern reassert itself? This observation, held with genuine neutrality, sharpens awareness of the patterns you are building and the ones you are dismantling. Behavior that is observed tends to gradually improve. Not because observation is magic, but because it keeps the question of who is leading in front of you rather than allowing it to disappear into the background of a busy day. Consistency over intensity is the principle that makes everything sustainable. Many people approach building self-command with periods of high effort followed by collapse and long gaps. This teaches the mind instability. Intense periods signal change is being attempted. Long gaps signal that the attempt has been abandoned. The pattern repeats. The mind adapts to the inconsistency by waiting it out. Small behaviors maintained every day, by contrast, teach the mind permanence. They establish the new pattern as the actual standard rather than as an aspirational exception. Your environment is a form of training whether you treat it as one or not. The conditions you live and work within either make disciplined behavior easier or harder. When distractions are immediately accessible and the tools of focused work require effort to reach, the environment is training toward distraction. The inverse is also true. Arranging your environment so that disciplined action is the path of least resistance reduces the daily decision load that self-command requires. This is not weakness. It is intelligent design of the conditions in which your training happens. Energy management is a form of leadership preparation. When you are exhausted, the capacity for emotional regulation diminishes. This is physiologically real. The systems that support deliberate response require resources, and those resources are depleted by inadequate sleep, sustained stress, and chronic neglect of physical basics. Protecting your energy through consistent sleep, through movement, and through adequate periods of genuine rest is not self-indulgence. It is maintenance of the very system you are training to lead. There will be days when none of this holds. Days when the emotions win clearly. Days when the old pattern reasserts itself completely and the response you chose with full commitment fails to appear. These days do not undo what has been built. What matters is the response to the failure. Spiraling into self-criticism deepens the damage by adding emotional weight that makes return harder. Simply noticing what happened, understanding it without dramatizing it, and returning to practice in the next available moment is the entire required response. What you repeat, you command. Every pause practiced in the face of pressure is a repetition. Every hard thing completed despite resistance is a repetition. Every emotional experience navigated without surrendering authority to it is a repetition. These moments are individually unremarkable. Collectively they form identity. They build a kind of inner authority that no longer requires effort to maintain because it has been practiced into the foundation of how you operate. The final shift, when it comes, is quiet. Control stops being something you fight for and becomes something you maintain. Like physical strength, it fades without use and grows with consistent practice. The mind that once negotiated constantly becomes more cooperative. Decisions feel clearer. Reactions slow naturally. Calm arrives more readily. Not because life has become easier, but because the system that meets life has become more stable. That stability is not dominance over your own experience. It is alignment with it. You feel everything. You experience the full range. But you are the one deciding what comes next. Every single time. Conclusion, the one who decides. Throughout this book, one principle has been present in every chapter, expressed from different angles but always pointing toward the same essential truth. Your emotions are not your enemy. Your thoughts are not the problem. The difficulty arises when either of them is permitted to lead unchecked. When the emotional state of the moment determines your timing. When the thought that appeared loudest decides your direction. When reaction replaces the choice that was genuinely available to you. This is how people lose their own direction, not through weakness, not through lack of intelligence or caring, but through the simple absence of the training that would have made self-command possible. You have now seen that this training is real and available. You learned that your mind was shaped by repetition to react rather than lead, and that a different kind of repetition can reshape it. You learned that emotions carry genuine information without carrying the authority to decide your responses. You learned that the pause between feeling and action is not hesitation but power, and that this pause can be built into the architecture of your daily behavior. You learned that discipline holds your direction steady across the emotional weather that motivation cannot survive. You learned that acting through resistance, rather than waiting for it to pass, is what teaches the mind that discomfort does not decide outcomes. You learn to observe your thoughts from a position of authorship rather than being authored by them. You learn that calm is not a gift but a practiced skill. And you learn that none of this settles into lasting change until it is treated as a daily structure rather than an occasional effort. None of this requires perfection. Perfection is another expectation that the untrained mind uses to delay beginning, because perfection, by definition, will never be achieved, and therefore the training never has to start. What is actually required is repetition. Small choices made consistently in the direction of who you are choosing to become. Each pause practiced. Each moment of discomfort met without automatic withdrawal. Each time you act from a decision rather than a mood. These moments seem ordinary. They compound into something extraordinary. At some point, something subtle but unmistakable shifts. You stop being surprised by your own reactions in the ways that felt destabilizing. You stop breaking the commitments you made to yourself and then facing the erosion of self-trust that followed. You stop living at the mercy of whatever your emotional state happens to be on any given morning. Your responses slow into something more deliberate. Your decisions carry more of your actual intention. You begin to trust yourself, not because you always feel capable, but because the evidence from your own behavior has accumulated into something you can rely on. That trust is the foundation of real confidence. Not the performance of confidence, not the temporary lift of motivated feeling, but the settled quality of someone who knows they will follow through, because they have followed through enough times for it to mean something. Life will keep placing demands on you. Stress will continue to arrive. Emotions will surge. The mind will produce its thoughts with their full intensity and urgency. None of that disappears. What changes is your relationship to it. You are no longer fully inside the storm, carried wherever it moves. You are present within it, feeling everything it brings, and choosing your response from the position of the one who decides. Your mind does not obey insight. It obeys patterns. Understanding what is true here creates awareness. Repeating what serves you creates authority. Build the patterns. Practice them in ordinary moments, in the conversations that test patience, in the routines that require showing up. Without the support of motivation, in the moments when avoidance whispers that today could be the exception. Those are the moments where leadership is built. Those are the moments that matter. What you practice becomes automatic. What you repeat becomes identity. And when the mind learns that your decisions are consistent, control stops being effort. It becomes your default. Not dominance. Not rigidity. Not disconnection from the richness of your own experience. Self-mastery. Your mind will follow whoever leads most consistently. Begin today, in the next small moment. That is where all authority is built.